As I was about to turn the TV off on Saturday night, the first reports came in of a terrorism attack underway in London. I stayed on the sofa, watching the eyewitness reports. I went online, looking at social media and news websites, trying to find more information, horrified. And also uncomfortable that I and the media were doing exactly what the terrorists would want. The journalists and people on social media reporting every dreadful detail. Me, the viewer, and millions like me, taking it all in. Because terrorists rely on the world's cameras and microphones to spread their message of fear and their ideology. It's a huge tension at the heart of the current struggle to contain today's terrorists, that those who seek to curtail people's freedoms use one of the fundamental tenets of a free society, freedom of speech, to do so. And that puts journalists in a particularly awkward position. It's natural that the media would want to report an atrocity, not least to tell people to stay away from danger. But there's a real and fraught question about how far you take that coverage. I'm Ruth Alexander, and this is The Inquiry on the BBC World Service. This week we're asking, how do you report terrorism? We'll look at the experience of 4 societies which broadly believe in free speech and where it was felt that that freedom was being exploited by terrorists. We'll examine the different actions taken and the impact they had, considering what, if anything, they teach us.
Part 1. Blackout.
Our first expert witness, historian Hanno Balz, is fascinated by a group of left-wing radicals from the 1970s.
Oh, everyone is. Everyone is.
Not everyone's written a book about them, though. The Red Army faction, also known as the Baader-Meinhof Gang, waged a violent campaign against the West German establishment that was, in their view, populated by Nazis turned capitalists, and
those militants had a media agenda.
In 1975, allies of the Red Army faction kidnapped a mayoral candidate for Berlin and demanded that people they saw as political prisoners be released. And not only that,
they also demanded that they wanted to see that live on German TV. And that happened.
The West German government agreed to release the prisoners and to do it in front of the cameras.
So we had this one day where there was 4 to 5 hours of live coverage of these German radical militants being released from prison, and you could see them entering the plane. And that was an immense provocation to say, we take over the TV stations, and they show our comrades greeting the audiences with the raised fist and then laughing, entering the plane, and off we go.
It was a political and media win for the militants and a defeat for the state.
Helmut Schmidt, the chancellor, vowed that that would never happen again. He felt like so powerless, he said later, that he had to give away control over the media and over his prisons.
He wouldn't repeat that mistake. In 1977, the gang kidnapped a leading businessman, demanding the release of prisoners again. This time, the government was determined that they would control what was reported in the media, not the kidnappers.
There was something that I would call news management. So we could be blunt and call that censorship. The German press and TV was asked by the federal government to refrain from reporting freely on what was going on, and they all agreed.
The German media were persuaded to publish only what the government wanted them to. It meant news agency feeds and press reports about the kidnap were checked by government officials.
Sometimes they would call the chief editor and say, you can't do this. We have one incident where newspapers were being printed already, and they were in the delivery vans, and they had to be brought back.
In order that a new government-approved version could be printed. How did the media feel about having their reporting managed or censored?
If you're a journalist, you don't want to be censored. But it was totally about the survival of the state and to get the kidnappers. So the press accepted that.
The crisis ended dramatically and controversially. Red Army faction prisoners were not released as the kidnappers had demanded, but found dead in their cells. A day later, the kidnapped businessman was found dead in the boot of a car.
And then the news ban was lifted.
And a pall of regret fell on the newsrooms.
Reading articles that came out like some weeks later, there was this kind of feeling of guilt or moral hangover that journalists said, we don't know if it was right that we followed these rules of censorship. And I think a lot of them realized, okay, this wasn't what we were supposed to do as members of the free press.
Paradoxically, Hanno Balz says, out of this period of censorship emerged a fully independent media.
One of the outcomes of this news censorship in 1977 was the professionalization and creation of an alternative press.
How do you report terrorism? In 1970s West Germany, the government persuaded the media to accept censorship, silencing a high-profile gang who were terrorising the establishment. But the censorship was temporary, and almost as soon as it was over, the media vowed never to accept it again. What happens if a government enforces censorship? That's also been tried before.
Part 2.
Gagged.
I remember sitting with a new baby on my knee, watching one of the terrorist groups or one of their front organisations, and you would see the face of somebody going blah, blah, blah with their mouth moving.
But peering at her TV screen, Jean Seaton knew something was amiss. She could hear a voice, but it was stilted, didn't seem to match the person on the screen. She saw a caption and realised
it was an actor's voice.
She wasn't watching a badly dubbed foreign film. This was the BBC News in 1988. Then our expert witness was one of millions of baffled viewers. Now, as a media historian and author of an official history of the BBC, she's been back over events to delve into what was going on. Through the 1970s and 80s, conflict had been raging in Northern Ireland. On one side, Republicans, mostly Catholics who wanted independence from the UK. On the other side, Unionists, largely Protestants, who wanted to stay a part of the UK. Paramilitaries on both sides of the argument committed violent attacks. The UK Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher, was conscious that the battles raged not just on the streets, but in the media.
And we must try to find ways to starve the terrorist and the hijacker of the oxygen of publicity upon which they depend.
In this speech in London in 1985, Margaret Thatcher was raising the idea of asking the media to come up with a voluntary code of conduct around the reporting of terrorism.
Because we don't censor, we never do. We request, sometimes.
But over time, the mood changed. Margaret Thatcher's resolve stiffened.
Mrs. Thatcher had been personally nearly blown up and her husband nearly killed. This had got very close to the heart of the state.
In October 1988, the Home Secretary Douglas Hurd announced a change of law.
What concerns us is the use made of broadcasting facilities by supporters of terrorism.
He banned the broadcasting of direct statements by Northern Ireland paramilitaries and the political parties associated with them.
This is not a restriction on reporting, it is a restriction on direct appearances by those who use or support violence.
It was an extraordinary moment.
A Liberal government that said it believed in a free press had just censored the media. Only the broadcast media, not the newspapers. The broadcasters were furious. They immediately started thinking how they could get round it. Soon after the announcement, the chairman of the BBC, Marmaduke Hussey, had lunch with the Home Secretary and tested the boundaries of the law.
Hussey proposes one or two things, like, can we voice over? And Hurd doesn't agree, but he doesn't disagree.
The BBC chairman made a note of this on a napkin and took it back to his colleagues. The law, it seemed, was open to interpretation. The BBC and its commercial rival ITN stuck to the letter of the law and refrained from broadcasting direct statements by the paramilitaries and their associates. Instead, they took their words and got an actor to say them, leading to the rather surreal situation Jean Seaton was taking in watching TV with her baby on her knee. To hear an example, here's one of the targets of the ban, Republican politician Martin McGuinness, before...
We're attempting to establish in Ireland a democratic socialist republic.
And after...
We're attempting to establish in Ireland a democratic socialist republic.
So the government failed to force the Northern Ireland paramilitaries and their political wings entirely off the television.
It was not effective in, open quotes, curbing propaganda. Indeed, it was a propaganda win, really, for those people that were repressed, because it made the British state look as if it was acting in a peculiarly repressive and out-of-order way.
Some say the ban, which was lifted only after a ceasefire was announced in the mid-1990s, helped promote the Republican cause, boosting fundraising in the United States. How do you report terrorism? In the UK, in the 1980s and 90s, the government brought in a law to censor media appearances by Northern Irish dissidents to try to stop the spread of their message. But a liberal state that broadly believed in freedom of speech, it stopped short of a full blackout, instead coming up with a half measure that our expert witness believes didn't achieve its aims and arguably backfired.
Part 3. Uninterrupted.
It was live throughout. You were actually just sitting there transfixed for the next 2 days, just watching this unfold in front of you, live.
Our third expert witness, Shailaja Bajpai, media critic at the Indian Express newspaper, remembers watching the Mumbai terrorist attack of 2008 unfold on TV.
This is great television at one level, right? It was a great television moment. I mean, it was a part of history. And you were right in there.
Terrorists armed with machine guns and hand grenades went on a rampage, targeting luxury hotels, the city's main railway station, and a Jewish cultural centre. And as the battle between the 10 gunmen and the police played out in front of millions of TV viewers in real time, Shailaja Bajpai says people began to realise this coverage might have a terrible cost for people trapped inside the hotels.
The main allegation was that there were people still inside whose lives were endangered. There were terrorists inside. And the fact that there was live coverage giving constant updates, trying to make contact with guests inside or even staff inside, jeopardized security operations.
In their breathless race to be first with every piece of information, TV reporters risked giving away the positions of hotel guests and the tactics of the security forces, unthinkingly helping the terrorists achieve their goal. To what extent do you think that this live coverage of the attack did the terrorists propaganda for them?
The minute you give coverage to any such incident, that's what they want. That's what they're looking for. And certainly at that time, everyone after the event felt, you just played into their hands.
The siege and the media circus ended after 60 hours. There followed a period of reflection and intense criticism of the media coverage.
Should we have gone that far? Should they have been allowed? The channels responded by saying, well, we'll go for self-regulation.
But for the new government that came in 2014, that wasn't enough. With hundreds of rebel groups posing a threat, it announced that
in future, all terrorist attacks cannot be covered live. No live coverage of a terrorist attack. So you would not see that kind of coverage again.
In November last year, the government took action against the broadcaster NDTV. It accused the news channel of broadcasting strategically sensitive information about a terrorist attack on an airbase.
They were accused of having shown live coverage of a certain incident.
The government ordered a 24-hour blackout of the channel as punishment. NDTV complained they'd been singled out unfairly. Their rivals agreed.
There was a loud uproar in all sections of the media. All the TV channels, all the print came together and said, look, this is not the way to go about it.
The media were saying, look, this is censorship. You can't do that.
Yes, exactly. It seemed that they should have been let off with a warning. It seemed too drastic to take them off the air.
Shailaja Bajpai says the backlash has forced the government to think twice about the NDTV ban and to put it on hold. And Shailaja Bajpai says it raises uncomfortable questions about how far censorship could go.
What you will see is now what the government wants basically for you to see of whatever the event was.
And it's the government, she says, which gets to decide what is terrorism. How do you report terrorism? In India, it was felt live rolling coverage of a marauding terrorist attack went too far, made the situation worse, and played into the terrorists' hands. It was agreed something had to be done. However, the government ban on live coverage is felt by some to give the government too much discretion, that it could harm the ability of the media to report openly on opposition to government. What happens when the media take it upon themselves to rethink terrorism coverage? Time for our final expert witness.
Part 4. Self-control.
Nabil Wakim is with the French newspaper Le Monde.
My official title is Director of Editorial Innovation, which doesn't mean anything, so you can just describe me as Deputy Editor.
On the 14th of July 2016, Bastille Day in France, the national holiday, Nabil Wakim was the editor on duty for the late shift.
I remember telling people, don't stay too long at the office, go home, have a rest. We had a difficult year, nothing's going to happen.
At around 10:30 that night, a lorry drove into crowds in the southern French city, Nice.
It was so shocking and so hard because it was more than 80 people died.
Just days later, a priest and a member of his congregation were killed by a knifeman. Nabil Wakim and his colleagues couldn't believe what they were reporting. Neither, he says, could their readers.
They were shocked about some of the pictures we have published about some terrorists, especially a picture of a terrorist called Mohamed Merah. He is in a car, very joyful, and he's very happy. And this picture was used a lot of time, probably too much.
The readers made Nabil Wakim and the other Le Monde editors think.
To have some pictures that might lead some readers to think that we participate to terrorist propaganda in some way or another was very disturbing to us.
They realized they needed to make a change.
It was kind of a turning point. We decided to publish a very strong editorial saying that we will stop publishing pictures glorifying terrorists.
So Nabil Wakim and his colleagues did this with the aim of moderating their coverage and of starting a wider conversation about how to report terrorism.
To send a signal to our readers and to our colleagues in the other media to say, hey, we should take this question seriously. We don't know if this is the best answer, but this is an answer, and we're ready for debate about how to cover terrorism.
It's very interesting because throughout this programme we've heard a number of stories about how the media at different times and in different places has fought against the idea of any kind of censorship on the subject of terrorism. And Isn't this what we're talking about? It's censorship, albeit self-censorship, but you are censoring yourself.
Well, no, I don't think so. I don't think it's about censorship. It's about making editorial decisions. This is what we do every day in newsrooms. We decide what we publish and what we don't publish, the stories we talk about and the stories we don't talk about.
Le Monde has been criticised by some of its competitors who say readers will stop trusting it if it withholds information. And of course, people can find out so much on social media now. But Nabil Wakim says journalists should exercise more discretion in what they publish. And for his newspaper, that means shifting the attention from the terrorists to the victims. Others might argue, though, that telling the victims' stories still gives publicity to the terrorists and their terrible work. Nabil Wakim says a journalist just can't ignore the story.
It's not only a good story as a journalist, it's an important story as a society. We need to explain what happened to these people. We need to understand where this is coming from. Otherwise, we'll never be able to rebuild anything.
A good story, an important story to society. Those, of course, are editorial decisions too, just like the decision not to give such dramatic coverage to things that kill people every day, like car accidents and heart disease, or the decision taken informally by much of the media not to report suicides in depth or to show graphic images of the victims of any kind of violence. The media could choose, individually or collectively, to temper its coverage of terrorism. How do you report terrorism?
That's a debate that's as old as modern terrorism itself. Modern terrorism developed in the late 19th century, and you could say it actually developed parallel to the development of a mass media society. So those two things went hand in hand.
The media, hand in hand with terrorism, it's an uncomfortable image. In this programme, we've heard that when governments in free societies have tried to censor media coverage of terrorism, it tends to be resisted, and the results are not all that effective. It feels like the best way to report terrorism would be with self-restraint. But when media competition has never been so intense, inflamed by the wild west of social media, self-restraint is in short supply. The inquiry was presented by me, Ruth Alexander, and produced in London by Simon Mabin and Phoebe Keane. The editor is Hugh Levinson. Next week, our focus is the opposition in Russia. And we'd love to hear what you think about the inquiry, so please feel free to review us wherever you get your podcast from.